Fellow Republicans, I speak tonight in advocacy of Frank Niceley's Bill 692 and its companion bill, House Bill 1527. It is important to us on a national level as well as a state level. 692 is essential so that we restore the balance of power through America. Now, what do I mean by balance of power in this case? Many times when I bring up the issue of balance of power in American government, POTUS, SCOTUS, Congress, and that's not wrong, but that's not all the story. So I ask you to go back with me to 1787. What was the balance of power in America at that time? There was we the people. There were the states as 13 sovereign, separate, free states. And there was something called the Confederation of States and Perpetual Union. Now, in order to get to that, I intend to work through this in some sequence. I intend to address the original intent and why it was that way, what was done right, what was done wrong, what were the consequences of the mistake that our forefathers made in 1913, how do we remedy it, and last and more importantly, what is your role? And I'm looking for some help on this because you have a very strong vested interest. That means an action plan here at the end, and I hope to have some time for questions and answers because some of this is not entirely intuitive. So anyhow, in 1787 we the people, we had the sovereign states, and we had this entity that wasn't working very well. So in order to address where we were going forward, it comes into the best sentence that was ever written in the history of the English language, namely the preamble of our Constitution. And if you look at the preamble itself in its original script, and I had to go all the way back to the National Archives to find this, there's a very strong subliminal message in there. What's the first thing you see in it? We the people. And on a scale of the size of the letter, we'll assign that a scale of 10. The next thing you see is of the United States, and that is on a scale of 2. And so then you go on to the meat of the preamble as to why they're doing this and so on, and at the end there's the United States of America on a scale of 1. Right in there with all the text as to why they were doing it. And that 10, 2, and 1 assignment of size is important because a particular concern they had, one of the most important concerns they had, was this issue of what happens with this federal government we are establishing. A big item on their mind was a government is like fire, a handy servant but a dangerous master. Have you heard that before? And they knew it, and they were concerned about what might happen here. So in order to deal with that, they worked very judiciously as to how to handle that and how to keep it down. You may have heard the Thomas Jefferson quote, "Two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so the second will not become the legalized version of the first." Does that bring to mind what we are dealing with today? So how did they tie down that federal government, namely the Senate? Recognize that when they stood up the Senate, they endowed it with some rather strong and unique powers. Look at them. there's the sole power to try impeachment, not only of the president and other officers, but judges. And don't forget that includes Supreme Court judges. The power and the responsibility to advise and consent on appointments of ambassadors and officers, the power for a veto override with numbers, the issue of ratifying treaties, and finally, well, they have the ability, participating with the House, to establish lesser courts as a way of controlling the Supreme Court. Basically, the Senate was established to serve as the agent of the states in D.C. in dealing with the federal government. Okay, so if the Senate is to control the federal government, who controls the Senate? And they set that up very artfully in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 2. The Senate will be composed of senators chosen by the legislatures thereof. Many people have spoken to the significance of that. I think one of the most eloquent was Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, and he speaks, the organization of the Senate becomes of inestimable value. It represents the voice, not of a district, not of a state, not of one state, but of all, and not of the interest of one state, but of all. Not of the chosen pursuits of a predominant population in one state, but of all pursuits in all states. It was firmly established to control the federal government. And it worked well for 110, 20 years. But what went wrong? Well, in 1913, for a number of reasons, the progressive movement and so on, they got a bee in their bonnet. And our forefathers, not our founding fathers, but our forefathers made a move that undid much of the genius of what our founding fathers did. Namely, they enacted the 17th Amendment in 1913. And so what does it say? Well, the core part of it is 2 senators from each state elected by the people thereof. How are we doing with direct popular election? So if we go back to that preamble and we think of that subliminal messaging with regard to the preamble, that 10-to-1 relationship, we will say that we the people remained at 10, but the states became 2 minus and shrinking. The federal government became 1 plus and growing, because those chains that Thomas Jefferson mentioned had been removed. Another way of speaking it is that the 17th Amendment is a direct and blatant circumvention of the 10th Amendment, dealing with states' rights. The 17th Amendment opened Pandora's box, let the genie out to grow, to expand, overreach, to usurp, and metastasize throughout the states as it subsumed the states. It neutered the states as a political entity. And basically, it deprived the states of their agency in D.C. And it enabled the progressive national subsumation of our sovereign states. So there are several ways of looking at what was wrong with regard to the 17th Amendment. Now, what are the consequences of the 17th Amendment? Well, in the bumper sticker phrase, federalism died, nationalism thrived. And there is a difference. The more you look into this, the more you recognize that there is a difference between federalism and nationalism. But to drill into some specific consequences, I have a list here of about a dozen. And I would encourage you to think about some other consequences that are directly traced to and have been enabled by the 17th Amendment. The first one I have up here somebody volunteered it for me, is the COVID response. Think about how much of that is a national overreach of what should be state issues. Gun control, education, health care. There is an issue of corruption of the role of the Supreme Court, the issue of interjecting national guidance and mandates on the issue of marriage, election laws, the erosion of parental rights. I want to drill down into one of those, specifically health care. I don't know of a more atrocious piece of legislation that's come out of DC than ACA Obamacare. And I present to you a thesis that Obamacare was directly enabled by the 17th Amendment. And we'll start with the fact that's involved. And I assume that people remember the Senate vote for Obamacare. It occurred on Christmas Eve of 2010. It was 60 to 39, and it was on strict party lines. You know, that waves a couple of red flags. What kind of legislation has to be passed on Christmas Eve? I become suspicious of anything that is passed on strict party lines. So let's parse that vote and look at a couple elements. The first and foremost item that comes to mind, Virginia, like everybody else, had two senators. Those two senators both voted aye in favor of it. But what was going on in the state that they supposedly represented? Within Virginia, the state of Virginia had in its legislature active legislation. A Health Care Freedom Act was moving through their legislature with strong bipartisan support, which would have trying to get a head start on what they could see coming in Obamacare. They eventually enacted it, like I say, with strong bipartisan support. The governor signed it and put it into law. And the state of Virginia very quickly joined the lawsuit suing against the enactment of Obamacare. Consider what those two senators did and what their state, in as strong a method as possible, indicated the state wanted. I see a strong dichotomy. And a conclusion has been stated: this flagrant disregard of the home state's wishes is the most egregious example of the effect of the 17th Amendment on voting in the Senate, and it obviously swung the outcome. We can speak about several other groups of votes on that one particular case, and you come to the conclusion that had there been even a reasonable representation or fidelity between the senators and the states they represented, Obamacare would have failed by maybe a dozen votes, possibly even 15. That, folks, is the consequences, a very direct, identifiable consequence of the 17th Amendment. Bradford, from whom I'm quoting, goes on to say, how can these things happen? The answer is indubitably because of the 17th Amendment. Senators have been cut loose from their state and are beholden only to their party and the moneyed special interests within their party. Obviously, the state governments have lost their representation and have been deprived of the direct vote in the Senate, i.e. their agency. The 17th Amendment did in fact nullify the entire Federalist principle of the Constitution. The balance in the federal system that was established by the Constitution is gone. So that goes back to 1913 and the results of it all the way up to today. You look at that and some other of those items that I went over, you really come to the Constitution, and come back to the preamble and to preface it, we the people of the states subsumed have allowed our federal republic to become a national oligarchy. And there is a difference between a republic and an oligarchy. In my thinking, and as I look at the characteristics of our national oligarchy, one of the problems we have with it is that there's so much of it. It comes at us in so many different ways. We are overburdened with regulations. Somebody eliminates one regulation and two more come up. It reminds me of the mythical Hydra from Greek mythology. The monster with the many heads, each head was that of a snake. They were immortal heads. If you cut one head off, two more came back. Does that sound familiar with the issue of federal regulations? You eliminate one, two more come back. The truth of the matter is, those same characteristics that made the Hydra threatening and a strong issue, those were the immortal heads. It had one mortal head in the middle of it. And if you cut off that mortal head, you kill the Hydra. I submit to you today that that mortal head of our national oligarchy is the Senate. And we have the ability to reach in and grab it. So that is the problem today, and the solution, which I advocate, is Senator Frank Niceley's 692. And you guys have the ability to look it up, and it's a page and a half and so on. And it's pretty straightforward, but I present to you the gist as I understand it. TGA representatives and senators of each party shall, by joint caucus and in open meeting, nominate a person as that party's candidate in the general election for U.S. Senator. I think it is valuable to go back and parse that, because there are meaning to each part of it. First off, TGA, that is the legislature thereof. The next part of it cures a weakness of the original Constitution that contributed to the 17th Amendment, namely the representatives and the senators of each party. So you're pulling both the House of Representatives and the senators together in a joint caucus and in open meeting. So you've got the legislature working as one entity on each side of the political aisle. We recognize the importance and the existence of political parties. And in open meeting, there will be no closed room, cigar-filled issues for coming up with a candidate. We'll nominate a person as that party's candidate in the general election. The general election. So what does this do? It bypasses the senatorial primary. Why do we want to bypass the senatorial primary? Folks, that is where out-of-state people, lobbyists, big government reach in and get control of our senatorial candidates with money. That is an important issue for us to eliminate. It brings the identification of the Senate nominees back to the folks that we see every weekend when they come back from Nashville, back to the first level of our government in that regard. This catches some people by surprise, and they say, how can you do that? Well, you just look another page or two. Article 1, Section 4 says, the time and places and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislatures thereof. That's our House and that's our Senate. And shall is not a permissive issue, it is a mandate. It says that you guys shall do it. And that is what we need to do. We should recognize that the enactment of 692 will restore senatorial nominations to the Tennessee General Assembly, like I say, with first level direct access. It bypasses the senatorial primary. And look at what, part of the problems we have with regard to getting good candidates, independent candidates to the Senate is that it costs from what, $25 to $50 million just to run the statewide primary. This, folks, brings it back into the hands of our first level elected government. Okay. That's the problem. That's the opportunity to solve it. And now we come to the question of what is our role in implementing the enactment of 692. Engineers, when we work in synthesis, we start at the result and come back. So the first step here in this enactment plan is February of 2022. Governor Lee signs 692/1527. Okay, in order to do that, he got to get it to his desk. Well, earlier in February of 2022, the General Assembly passes and forwards it. Okay, now what does it take for that to happen? Ed will speak first to the House for 1527. The numerical issue is we need 50 votes on the floor. But in order to get it to the floor, we need 5. First step is we need 5 of 8 votes in the Elections and Campaign Finance Subcommittee. Oh, that gets close to Knox County because Knox County has 40% of those 5. My friend Dave Wright, and you're representative of the 18th District. It is your responsibility to get those people on board come election time. But that doesn't mean that these 2 over here, sitting and smiling, get off the hook. Because between now and January, they can exert considerable influence by signing on as co-sponsors. And they have some constituents here, and my next duty or assignment here is for their constituents to share with them the importance of it and why we expect them to be on board as co-signers. Okay? In late January of 2022, and this is Frank's schedule, he will pull 692 out. In order to get it to the governor's desk, we need 17 votes on the floor. My senator, your senator, everybody's senator is 1/17, which means they have slightly less than 6% of the power to get there. But in order to get it to the floor, we need 5 votes out of 10 on the state and local committee in order to make it the first hurdle. Now, there are generally some people here from Roane County or Campbell County or so on. You have 1/5 or 20% of what's needed to provide those 5 votes. Senator Ken Yeager is on that committee, and he is therefore an important part of it. And if there's no one here from Roane County, well, we need to be working with them to get them working on Ken Yeager to bring him on board. There's another 1/5 of that number that we need, and that's the biggest 20%, and that is our friend Richard Briggs. Richard is the chairman of the state and local committee. As such, he not only is one of the 5 votes, but because he's the chairman, he's the biggest 20%. So you have an assignment to work with Richard, explain to him that you understand the 17th Amendment, the problems of it, and that you advocate putting the federal government, the national government, back in its box by reclaiming control of the Senate via reclaiming control of the nominees. There's also generally some people here from Anderson County and even from our North Knox County. Do not overlook the importance of Senate Leader Randy McNally, and he has some constituents here in Knox County. He'd probably tell you it's not appropriate for him to sign on as a co-sponsor, and he doesn't vote on it until it gets to the floor, but he leads the Senate, he has influence, he wields influence where he wants to, when he wants to. So if you have an opportunity to communicate with Randy McNally, let him know that you consider this important and you're looking forward to his support. So anyhow, that deals with January and between January. So next month, what we need to be working on is co-sponsorship. Recognize that every General Assembly legislator is a potential and valuable co-sponsor. Now next week, I'd ask you to communicate developing constituent advocacy. Contact and communicate with your fellow citizens. Enlist, contact, inform, motivate to get them in there. Tonight, we are taking an early step in the form of citizen education. I hope enlightenment, I hope motivation, and enlistment. So that's what I ask you to do, is get involved. This is government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and this is the way that legislation should move. We, the people, need to recognize what the situation is, how it works with or how it offends our values. And knowing that, then we should work it up the administrative organization by letting these folks know what we want done. That's it. I'm